Sam, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You're right now in Providence, Rhode Island, which you were a fellow at the Watson Institute, or you still are a fellow?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
America's smallest state.
Right. Fantastic. I think that we're going to have a very fascinating conversation about populism and your most recent book, History Repeating. Before we do that, I'd love for you to share a bit of your background to my listeners so they can get a picture of who you are and what you do.
Sure. My background is in political risk, which I believe is a topic you have some familiarity with yourself. Basically trying to help businesses avoid losses from political events like trade wars and that kind of thing, and topically, and I've been doing that for about 20 years.
Great. And let's talk a little bit about the origins of the book History Repeating, because I think you've written other books and you've looked at political risk for a number of years. What led you to wanting to address this topic? What did you see? And when did that happen?
When did I start? I think I started perhaps with a proposal in around 2014, 2015. The book was initially called Turmoil, and then it was called Angry People. And it was about this is something that we've seen in the political risk field, which is mysteriously advanced economies have been getting worse and worse in their risk ratings for about a decade now. And it's been a pretty dramatic trend. I think the big trend that everyone's heard of, the big example of this that everyone's heard of is, well, of course, there's the Greek sovereign default, where Greece goes from being an advanced economy to being downgraded to emerging market status. I think that's the first time in history that any country has ever done that. And the other big example that everyone should be familiar with is, of course, the ratings downgrade for the United States by, I believe it was Standard & Poor's. And one of the reasons that S&P listed for making that downgrade was politics, the efforts to use the debt ceiling legislation to try to force concessions from the White House by Congress. And the idea is, if you're going to wield that kind of political football, debt default as political football, it's bad for credit risk in a country. So you've sort of seen countries getting riskier and riskier, politics getting riskier and riskier. And so I wanted to write a book about why this was happening. And in the pre-Brexit, pre-Trump era, that proposal didn't get very far. But then right after Brexit, I thought, it's definitely going to get. But actually, it's still, people were thinking this is just a one-off. And then when Trump got elected, the next morning, I got an email saying, "Remember that book that you were pitching?" And the rest is history.
Did you have some hypotheses that you wanted to explore, such as the end of it was the global financial crisis, and therefore we've got great state intervention into the economy, or we have rising inequality, or we have disgruntlement amongst the masses against the establishment? Were there certain things you wanted to test?
I can't say. So it's not an academic book. It's more of a sort of a fun history case studies kind of book.
There aren't too many academic books that reference Blade Runner.
Yeah, that's right. But it has quite a few jokes in the book. But so there isn't really. It doesn't really test a hypothesis. But there was, I guess, of those issues that you mentioned, I was mainly trying to figure out, do a review, kind of an intro to political risk, review of why countries become unstable, try to apply that to the present case and sort of see if I could explain what was happening, which I think to some extent, I was able to do, talking certainly about mobilization, political mobilization, how people have gotten more involved in politics and what that kind of politics looks like. And that sort of element of the book was really borne out in the midterm elections, where the turnout in the United States was higher than in most presidential elections or in many presidential elections. In a Brexit vote, where famously 2.8 million people voted who had not voted in the previous general election, and I think an overwhelming majority, about 80% of them, voted for Brexit. So what's getting people mobilized into politics in a way that they haven't been before? I talked a lot about that. I did talk a lot about inequality, but and found that to be quite interesting. And I did talk a lot about the financial crisis. Actually, I think if we were to say what's the main factor, one thing you often hear in people's debates in the United States and in the United Kingdom is what has caused our country to become so singularly messed up, and what's the sickness in American culture that's caused Donald Trump to rise, or what are the issues in British culture that have caused people to vote for Brexit. But of course, those kinds of analyses, while useful, I think kind of overlook the point that this is happening everywhere, not everywhere, but in a great many places worldwide. And of course, what else happened just about everywhere is global financial crisis. So obviously that was a big area where I was looking into as well.
Right. Well, let's maybe start with what populism actually is. How do you define it? How do you approach it in the book?
Right. Well, a straightforward definition is if you claim, this is usually called the ideological definition of populism, if you claim to be representing the people against a corrupt elite, then that makes you a populist. And if there are lots of other definitions of populists, and populists are charismatic, populists are irresponsible, populists are deliberately vulgar, but most of those other definitions tend to stem from that basic ideological definition. If you're campaigning for the people against a corrupt elite, then probably the policies you're going to advocate are going to be considered by that elite to be irresponsible. Right? If you're campaigning against a corrupt elite, maybe to differentiate yourself from the establishment, you'll be deliberately vulgar. Donald Trump is by no means the first or most, even the worst American politician to do that. There was a Louisiana politician by the name of Huey Long who famously got drunk during a press conference. He makes Trump look positively restrained. So that's the basic definition of populism. And give you an example of that. We can play Name the Populist. Okay, here's a quote. Every day I wake up determined to deliver a new life for the people all across this nation that have been ignored and neglected and abandoned. The forgotten men and women of our country. They're forgotten, but they're not going to be forgotten for long. These people work hard, but they no longer have a voice. I am your voice. Can you guess?
Well, I think that's Trump.
That is Trump.
But that could be Juan Peron or any number of folks who've worn that populist banner, I suppose.
Right. But you get that sort of thing. He's the voice of the people. That's probably his most famous and best. Yeah. And probably the best populist line. And Nigel Farage had a great one. This is a once in a life opportunity to tell the establishment what you think, which is again kind of getting that people versus elite. Yeah. I mean, of course, Farage's famous one is, this is a victory for the people, victory for ordinary people, fighting against the multinationals. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but fighting against the multinationals, against big politics. The ordinary people against multinationals, big politics. Classic populist line, and that's really I think the only thing. If that ideology is the centerpiece of your campaigning, and it helps, and it's why people support you, then that is what makes you a populist. And that there are other definitions that people like to add sometimes to make a particular regression equation work out. But there are other definitions people like to add, but I think that's the main one.
The vulgarity point is interesting because what people say about Donald Trump is, oh, finally, we're Trump supporters. Finally, we've got, a politician who really speaks his mind. Yes. There's no filter. He speaks like I speak. And I guess one doesn't have to be vulgar, but there are certain words that politicians use that just ordinary people just don't use in everyday speech.
That's very true. And that, well, this definition, actually, this definition of populism as being embracing the cultural low, or low culture, popular culture, mass culture, as by someone who's quite elite. In the case of Donald Trump, that definition actually was made for Latin American populists. It wasn't originally a U.S. definition, but it's certainly that is something that Donald Trump has done to a huge degree. It doesn't just differentiate him. It has a lot of other functions as well, right? By being a clown, a populist politician gets media coverage. And the big problem politicians have if they try to embrace a populist platform is the establishment media tends to be hostile, often spectacularly hostile. Donald Trump was not endorsed by a single national daily newspaper in the United States. That should have been 10 years ago. That would have been the kiss of death.
Right. What I and I'm no Trump fan, but what is brilliant about what he did is he's kind of doubled down on that and said, they're the enemy of the people, and I'm here, and just wrapped it into the whole storyline.
Absolutely. And that, I think, from now just momentarily putting my political risk consultant hat back on, that has been a real challenge, I think, for businesses seeking to deal with this political phenomenon, is when you read something in the newspaper, the newspaper, the newspapers, many of them that we read, the Financial Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they're sort of convinced they're in this civilizational struggle against populism. So they've become they become players in this political battle. And we rely on these sources to be objective and to tell us if something's really risky or not. But now when you read something about what the terrible things that are going to happen after Brexit in a UK newspaper, is that being written by someone who you trust, who's a respected scholar, maybe they're a respected journalist, maybe they're a respected political leader? Are they writing that for reasons of rhetoric and to demonstrate how horrible it would be if this happened? Or are they writing what they think will actually happen? And you never know that anymore. That's really, I don't, it's not quite fake news, but it really has caused a problem in that a lot of the sort of sources that we tended to rely on for political analysis, excellent political analysis, and often that analysis is excellent when it's about other countries. But sources that we tended to rely on for analysis, even academics to some degree, are now caught up in this battle, and it's very hard to get straight analysis of what's going on.
Well, it's the same in the UK where I live on Brexit. Actually, some of the Irish media, they offer some of the best analysis on Brexit, because it's just, it's objective, and it's much more objective. It's not entirely objective. Obviously, Ireland has a huge stake in the outcome, but it tends to be, I find it's much better than what you find in the UK. Personally, that is.
Yes,
so I can definitely see
so.
that.
Yeah, I've been reading a bit of Indian coverage of the U.S. because, you have this problem where it is really hard with the U.S. papers, and there are people, even people who are really well respected. There is this book called How Democracies Die, which is a very good book by two well respected scholars who are covering the research on which it is based is excellent, scholarship of the highest quality, but the way the book is done is all the research is presented in a way that is designed to show how much of a menace Trump is to U.S. democracy, which these scholars obviously believe is the case, and I can certainly respect their opinion. On the other hand, the way it's presented is very misleading because if you sort of are looking at their cases, they are cases of democracies that are much, much weaker than the United States, and in no way relevant. I mean, in only the most huge stretch of the imagination are these relevant to the U.S. case. And so, and I can understand why it's important and why it's important to sort of to fight this battle. But then again, you're trying to also rely on these sources for objective analysis, so it makes it hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's. It does make it very hard. Let's maybe dive into some of the things that you've looked at in the book, and I suppose the first one would be why do people vote for populists in the first place? What compels them? And I saw you speak, and you had this wonderful. You summarily dismissed the book. I think it's called True Believer that Hillary Clinton had recommended to her staff about Trump. There are a lot of myths and legends, I guess, about why people vote for populists. So I think it'd be good to explore that a little bit.
Well, I think that this area has gotten a lot better. So there was an initial reaction, which you still see, but the initial reaction was, people are insane. Unless you can identify a causal factor that caused everyone to go insane very suddenly all at the same time, and not just in the U.S., but in lots of countries around the world, you're going to have a hard time with that. It's really it's a tricky one to argue with a straight face, but it went on for a long time, a year of the insane thing. And then there's the whole you're voting against your interests. And that's a hard one because as is undeniably the case, people really feel that they have been done badly. They have done badly under the current system. Then are they voting against their interests? This is a toughie. This is a tough one to unpack. But one of the most obvious reasons that people have voted for populists, and this is not just a reason that people vote for populists, it's a reason people vote in general, and that is because of the global financial crisis and the economic downturn. There is a very strong link between the performance of the economy as a whole and people's votes. So when the economy does very badly, then there's this kind of called economic voting. There's this kind of punishment effect where people punish the government that has been doing badly. And most of the research is on recessions and economic downturns and what's happening on a day-to-day basis. There's very little looking at financial crises, but the research that I've looked on, the research that does exist on financial crisis suggests that the effect is really long-term, at least a decade. So you're getting this kind of punishment vote against establishment political parties. Most countries, pretty much every establishment party was involved in some way or another with the financial crisis and the aftermath. And so you're getting this vote that is against essentially punishment for poor performance, and that is helping the rise of populists in a lot of countries. In the Eurozone, in Brazil, it's more for things that happened after the financial crisis, or at least as much for things that happened at the Eurozone debt crisis in the case of Europe, and the terrible macroeconomic management that happened in the case of Brazil. But you're getting these kind of punishment votes for poor economic performance. It doesn't have to be populists to pick that up. Anyone who's willing to differentiate themselves from the establishment parties, Macron in France being probably the most centrist example. But it doesn't have to be establishment parties, but a lot of these votes have gone to populists. Right.
And I've heard the phrase punishment vote, and also that it's I guess a negative sum loss. Am I saying that right? Where the outcome of the vote will hurt me, but it's going to hurt, you guys in Washington, Westminster, wherever, much more than me. Relatively.
Wow. That's possible. I mean, we've certainly, that's the definition of political risk right there, when you get to the point, the UK papers have been saying lately, there's a bit of a tangent, but the UK papers have been saying lately that Jeremy Corbyn his strategy is transparently, if he can make the Conservatives own hard Brexit, then the Conservative Party will crash, split apart maybe, and Labour will rule. That's kind of sacrificing your own country for the sake of your political career. And of course, that is the fundamental driver of political risk anywhere, is when people start doing that. That's what advanced economies are very good at not doing. So again, this is an example of political risk coming back.
Yeah, absolutely.
If it's true.
I live in London. I was a Remainer. I got the vote out on referendum day, and in my constituency was Labour, so all of the volunteers were Labour folks, and there was a nonchalance about some of them, and even some of them said, well, if Leave does win, then that's going to be really bad for Cameron and the Tories, so that'll be good for us. And it's just like, guys, it's a little bigger than but that's the problem, right? It's party over country and national interest, and I guess somehow we have veered in that direction in Western democracies to an extent.
Yes, I think so far a limited extent, although I'm prepared to be shocked by the eventual Brexit outcome. But I think so far a limited extent. I mean, most of the most severe things have been where you've pitted two countries against each other, like the Greek default, right? This is country versus country, and that's proved to be really brutal and a high political risk. Less so in the case of individuals. I do think the one important thing to keep in mind about these punishment votes is when they occur, a voter is not giving a cry of economic despair. They are not punishing a government for what's happening in their personal life. They are voting. They're punishing a government for what happens in the national economy. If you look at people's if you look at people's votes, they don't correlate with their personal financial circumstances or changes in their personal financial circumstances hardly at all. They correlate with what's happening in the national economy. Right.
So it's an national economy. It's an indictment against the leadership of the country for what it's been doing, rather than my income has gone down 10% or my real income's gone down 10% in the last 3 years or whatever. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. That's right.
That's super interesting.
That's something that people find hard to grasp, and it's something that I think when trying to theorize about what has driven people to vote in a particular way, try to think about if that's driven your vote. Has my income went down, and would I change my vote, or have I lost my job? Did I change my vote? If that's true, and I do think it does happen in some cases, then you can think of that might have been driving things in the public at large. But if it's not true, and I think it rarely is true, then that you can put your hand up and say, well, my income went down, and so I voted Labour. And that is incredibly rare. People vote based not on personal issues, they vote on political issues. And I think that there was this drama recently about Brexit and Netflix. It was American made, I think, but it was pretty good, I thought. But the one thing that was really bad about it is it attempted to understand what had happened for the people who had voted for Brexit, but it did so in a very, very incorrect political science speaking kind of way, in that it had this lady who was representing the people who voted for Brexit, and she's screaming about everyone ignores me, no politicians ignored, and that's voting on politics, and it's very difficult to kind of keep that in mind, that it's not usually it's not personal issues that are driving votes. It's political issues.
Yeah, would you say that that's fairly universal in emerging markets as well as what's happened recently?
Have far less data on emerging markets, but so far, at least for the issue of economic voting, where you're voting on the performance of the economy, the emerging markets information that does exist, the tests that does exist, have pretty much all found that people vote on the performance of the national economy, not on their own incomes. The only exception, there's been a couple studies, oddly, of Denmark, but really hundreds and hundreds of studies, and they pretty much all come to the same conclusion.
Right. Yeah, I guess that fits Brazil, for example. I suppose I don't really know about. I'm not sure how it fits the Philippines recently, but there was the different. You know, obviously, it's different. It's a different country and context, but it seems to make sense, doesn't it?
Well, maybe we could briefly mention inequality at this. So inequality, right there, the obvious thing, you mentioned the Philippines, Brazil, the obvious thing to link these countries and populism is inequality. And of course, the UK is one of the most unequal countries in Europe. I think maybe Spain might be slightly higher, maybe Greece, but UK is pretty close to the top. The US is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Mexico, Brazil. And so all these countries have gone populist over the past year or so, or before. And so people have always linked inequality and populism, at least in popular commentary, but pretty much every academic effort to find a link between inequality and populism has been a failure, which is surprising, right? I mean, and especially after what's happened in 2016, 2017, 2018 with Brazil and Mexico being two of the most unequal countries on earth electing populist leaders, sooner or later that regression is going to work. But so far, efforts to actually test this statistically, this link have been really hard pressed to find a link, which is. And you can sort of see that in history, right? The far-right populism in Europe, which is kind of the big trend that Europe and the UK have been sort of riding for the past few decades, since the 1980s. I guess it started in the 1970s, but in the 1980s. This surge started in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Germany, among the most egalitarian countries on earth. So if you're going to link this to inequality, it's going to be hard, and you can see why that might be difficult to find such a link if you actually try to think about all the cases rather than just the cases that spring to mind. So, but yeah, it is actually really hard. I do think there might be links, but it is really hard to find any kind of simple link between inequality and populism.
But one of the things you did mention there when you talk about the rise of the far right in Western Europe, for example, you've also talked about the lack of trust in political institutions in the United States for the last several decades, and so in some ways, we've been staring at this for some time.
Yes, and this the lack of trust. You mentioned is a big one, and that is definitely something that populists capitalize on. So here I've got another name a populist for you. Okay, here's the quote. Okay, the problem we've got right now in Washington is it works great for those who got money to buy influence, and I'm fighting against that. And you bet I'm going to make a lot of people unhappy. But at the end of the day, I don't go to Washington to work for those people. Our government should be working for the people, and that's the movement I'm going to lead. So you got that people versus elite. Who said it?
Is that Ross Perot?
That's a good one. Actually, it could be any candidate. It's actually Elizabeth Warren announcing her candidacy, announcing her presidential candidacy. And that anti-system message, a system is broken message, is something that populists get into a lot. And I'm not going to say that is every populist necessarily ends up doing that, but many do. Another thing that Trump said famously is probably his second most famous line after "I am your voice." Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so he's again saying the system is broken, and this is capitalizing on that sort of lack of trust in politics, in the political system, and it makes populists really unusual. It sort of makes them very different from other types of politicians because they're campaigning not just to win your vote, they're campaigning against the system. They are like, and this is the point I really belabor in the book, they are like little revolutionaries. So actually I start out with some actual revolutionaries like Lenin and the Iranian Revolution. And I say, these people against the system, they have some surprising similarities to these populists today who are campaigning against the system. But
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, but it's really hard to explain why this kind of lack of distrust in the system. This is also something that's happened globally. It's actually in countries like Brazil and Mexico and the Philippines, which have had a long battles with populism. It's not something that's happened recently. It's something that's always been there, and populists have always capitalized on it in those countries. Right? You had Estrada in the Philippines, famously. Even Marcos had a bit of populist in him. So this is something that's been happening a long time in these countries. It is relatively new in the advanced economies that this distrust in this system has risen, and it's risen in both U.S. and Europe. And why it's risen, though, that's harder to say. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, that is interesting. I was going to ask you if you could just expand a little bit more on the Russia and the Iran pieces. And although I think you probably did make those parallels there, but what was interesting to you about those two cases that they were worth chapters in your book?
Well, in the Russia case, what I wanted to show is that when you have a political movement that's coming up. At the time, the crazy narrative about how people are crazy, I think that's really kind of started to go away, and people have started to say, well, maybe people who vote for Trump aren't crazy, and we need to understand why they voted for Trump. And at least in the U.S., I'm not sure. Maybe in the U.K., people are still saying that people who voted for Brexit are crazy. I don't know. But that crazy narrative has started to go down a little bit. But what I wanted to show was, if you are going to get a political movement together, you don't need a bunch of crazy people. That's not going to help you. What you need is people who feel politically empowered, and you need to make them feel empowered. Because if you are hopeless and despondent and despairing, you're not going to take action. You're not going to vote. It's when you have hope. And so what I talked about was how actually the Bolshevik movement, or actually more broadly the socialist movement in Russia, before Lenin even really gets involved, is with, surprisingly, the most well-off of the working class, the most well-off of the new labor unions. The most successful workers in Russia are the vanguard of this unit, of this movement. So it's not the people who are suffering the most necessarily. It's people who are the most politically effective. And that is a really key point to keep in mind, is this political effectiveness is crucial in any kind of mass movement, because it is so hard to get people to take action together, political action together, and as you probably found when you're trying to get out the vote in for the Brexit referendum, it is very, very hard to convince people to take political action, and really doing that relies on people being politically effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to touch on the role of technology as well in all of this. It's a point that you make.
Yes.
The technology has a role to play in populist movements, and it would be great to talk a little bit about that.
Well, that links to this point that I just made,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where technology provides a way. One thing that's happened is rural areas and areas that were completely out of the political limelight, they're completely out of the national, not completely out of the national media, but largely out of the national media in the United States, pretty similar in the UK, I think, is dominated by city papers, Washington Post, New York Times, some extent LA Times, Wall Street Journal. They are in New York, maybe they're in Washington, maybe in LA. They're not from middle America. Technology like social media has given people from rural areas increasing voice in the last few years, in the last decade or so. You saw that in the Tea Party movement. Again, I'm talking about effectiveness. Like movements coming from these regions have suddenly become far more politically effective than they were 10 years ago, partly because people can get the message out, partly because organizing over social media makes it cuts down on some problems of distance. These people really just can't meet up because they're hundreds of miles away from each other, unlike people in New York or Washington, much easier to get together in person, or London, much easier to get together in person. I mean, in London, I know it's hard. You have to commute an hour to see anybody. But,
yeah, you need your passport to cross the river, but yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's true too. But in rural America, right, really hard for political movements to be effective. And that has been changing, and you've seen that really shake up politics in the form of the Tea Party, and you've seen it really shaking up politics in the form of this movement for Trump and these mass rallies. Okay, mass rallies are people to come together, but getting people out to attend these mass rallies and spreading the word, this is through social media, and this makes people much more politically effective. And social media is driving. I mean, this revolution started first for us. People in the political risk business, it started first in emerging markets. Actually, that was where the big impacts were felt with these huge demonstrations, the color revolutions in. You got the Arab Spring more recently, but then also the Orange Revolution in Ukraine earlier on, people power movements in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And that was probably the earlier impacts, but now we're really feeling the impacts here in Europe and America. Right.
I mean, that people power, I was in the Philippines during the second people power movement in 2001, and you're absolutely spot on that the text message in the Philippines is, it's just ubiquitous. So it was just so easy to mobilize, so much easier to mobilize than it would have been, even 5 years before that.
Exactly. The broadcast text message. Protests today are less like if you really want to do it, right? If you really want to, and this is not something we've experienced. Maybe the London riots actually, but it's generally not something we've experienced in the U.S. or UK. But if you really want to have a disruptive protest, the level you can get to now is so different than what you could achieve even 20, 30 years ago, because it's less like an angry march and more like a hyper effective flash mob protest. If you really want it to be disruptive, it is just can pop up instantly. People can coordinate on the fly. I mean, it does worry me that that the protests can be so effective. We haven't. Aside from maybe the London riots, we really haven't seen that here. I mean, you've seen people organizing, right? The Women's March in the United States, largest single day demonstration in U.S. political history, the Women's March. And that's driven in large part, partly because there's so many women, but partly because social media enables this kind of national mobilization. So but that wasn't an effort to disrupt things. If you started to try to get disruptive with this technology, that does worry me that it could really get nasty. But so far, I think we really haven't seen that, and I hope we don't.
Yeah, you mentioned the fax machine in the Soviet Union as well as being, that here's a technology that the authorities, it was new, so the authorities found it much more difficult to monitor and censor.
Right, and that's another angle is that it gives you a voice. So I mentioned Trump early on. We were talking about the vulgarity of politicians deliberately being vulgar, like Donald Trump, and he also deliberately plays the clown,
right?
And that's to generate news coverage. Well, the social media is providing a channel for politicians who have messages that the establishment media would not typically convey. One way they can get coverage in the media is by saying incredibly shocking things. I think in one of the books I read about Brexit, it might have been All Out War, I can't remember, but one of the books I read about Brexit, they talked about putting deliberately controversial things into the media, taking it out and then putting it back, and then denying it, then undenying their denial, and then just to get more and more media coverage off of some controversial thing they said. But they also don't have to do that, because now you can tweet your way to victory, like the Soviet dissidents, and they had the fax machine, which you couldn't listen in on. You had, famously, every time you take a phone call in the Soviet Union, you say hi to the person who's listening in on your call. But with the fax machine, they couldn't listen in on it, at least not at first. And so it was this channel for communication. And that's the other thing that social media enables, is it enables somebody like Trump to tweet their way around the fact that the national media are ignoring them. Right.
Can we talk a bit about what populists tend to do when they get into power? You talk and the role of ideology, and there are whole hosts of examples of good to very, very bad and very corrupt. What do populists tend to do? If you can identify a trend or a common thread once they get into power.
Well, okay, so a couple things. So here, let's one more name that populist. This is an old populist, pretty much impossible to get, but let's try. In the hands of the people's government, power is wholesome and proper. Misuse of the powers of capital must be ended, or the capitalist system will destroy itself through its own abuses.
Wow. It's shot in the dark, but I'll say Juan Peron, but I don't know.
He's a good one, actually. He's got some great quotes. It's actually another American. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I think that is, people, especially in the United States, especially on the left, but I think people in general see him kind of as a hero of reform and the New Deal, but also sort of establishment. But he actually, in his later incarnations, he became quite populist. And I think that's something to point out, because something people often ask me is does any good ever come of populism? Can there ever be a good populist, or aren't they always just destructive? And that's, I think, people get towards this definition of populists being irresponsible. But the thing I want to point out is most reformers, real radical reformers, have a bit of a populist in them. People who really do. They need to, because you're against the system, right? Roosevelt is doing this people's government versus the powers of capital. He's doing this people versus elite element. He's definitely got this populist line going, but he's also intending to be a reformer and to fix things. So I do think there can be certainly reformist populists. Now, that said, you could pick any number of things that tend to happen with populists, and this is more case study than saying doing a sort of comprehensive analysis of the whole set of populists everywhere. But the two things that tend to happen with populists. One is they tend to get impeached. Huey Long was impeached in his political career, I think at least 4 or 5 times, and then he would always come back. Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, impeached any number of times. Juan Peron, the military coup overthrows him. Not once, at least several times, several attempted coups, and then successful coup, and then another coup. If you're going against the establishment doesn't appreciate it and can overreact in ways that are, in fact, in some ways, it's less a populist who's a danger to democracy, and it's the establishment reaction that's a danger to democracy. I was listening to there's a a woman who had just won a national book award, Russian. I cannot remember her name, but she just won a national book award in the United States for a book on Russia. And she said after the election, Obama or Clinton should have declared the election results null and void. And in a way, that is a more likely scenario than Donald Trump doing anything, because you could see a lot of people with a lot of power backing such a move. And so impeachment is a big thing for populists, or irregular removal from office is a big thing for populists. Another big thing is, another big thing is they actually tend to be relatively moderate, relatively centrist.
That's interesting.
It's partly because their messages are not so much about policy, unlike most politicians who campaign on, say, making the education system better, or fixing the roads, fixing the railways, nationalizing industries in the case of Jeremy Corbyn. Most politicians campaign on policy, but populists are often really delivering an anti-system message more than they are delivering a particular policy, or they're pledging to reform the system. And even just by being in Washington to some degree, Trump is shaking up the system. And so I think a lot of people can be happy on that basis, even though his policy record, aside from, on things like Supreme Court justices and things like that, his policy record has not been too remarkable, because, he basically has a hard time getting through anything through the House and Senate. So, yeah, so populists tend to be surprisingly centrist, in government,
and I guess we're seeing that at least economically in Brazil, where the markets have kind of gone up, and there's some optimism around, I suppose, at least some economic stability, even though there's a whole range of rhetoric that will get spouted.
Exactly. Markets do tend to love a populist. You saw that same phenomenon when Trump was elected, markets going up. Markets do tend to love a populist, because, especially a right populist, because they do tend to be pretty establishment. It's, as I said, populists can be real reformers, real radical reformers, but often they try to be establishment in the first, or try to be relatively moderate in the first instance. And the danger can be when you do get into this cycle of impeachment or irregular removal from office, then you get people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela going the full Castro. I don't think he ever wanted to do that. I think it was when he was up against the wall.
Well, it makes sense, right? Because if you get the establishment that are that's coming after you and impeaching you and all the rest, it just proves your point, and it just galvanizes the support.
Exactly. So it really can play into the hands of a populist if they are irregularly removed. It can. Huey Long, I don't want to give this, don't want to, spoiler alert if you're reading my book, Huey Long was shot. That's pretty intense, and then that kind of ended, thanks to Roosevelt, in part to Roosevelt picking up the populist message, that kind of ended the populist surge in the United States that when Huey Long was shot. So I don't want to say that irregular removal never, quote unquote, works, but a lot of the times it hasn't worked. And here I am going to commit the same sin I accused people who wrote How Democracies Die. I'm going to compare the U.S. and cases that really aren't relevant, or aren't directly relevant. But Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, this Thai billionaire, gets into power in the wake of a financial crisis. The establishment hates him. No one thinks he's going to win. He wins. He shocks everybody. He appoints all his relatives to high political office. He tries to fire anyone who tries to investigate him. He gets in all sorts of investigations, and it's really similar, uncannily similar to the United States situation. What happens is he gets thrown out of the country. His friend gets elected. He comes back. He gets thrown out again. His sister gets elected. He comes back. It's just because every time he was thrown out, that just fed the narrative of his supporters that the system was corrupt, and they were sort of proving the establishment really did control the system in the minds of Thaksin's supporters.
I think you could argue the same thing with Juan Peron. and
Absolutely.
the legend of Juan Peron, because the same sort of thing happened, and you're just creating more support and galvanizing the base. So
Exactly.
that's interesting.
And it's crucial for populists to do that, to have that kind of, Juan Perón, one of his famous quotes was, people say the Peronist movement is a centrist movement. That's a grave error. Peronism is neither left nor right nor center, which sounds insane. But he's saying the thing that drives my support is this anti-system message, not this message about leftist policies or centrist policies or right-wing policies. It's this anti-system message. And I'm not left, right, or center. I'm against the whole thing. And to some extent, that any kind of irregular removal from office just feeds that kind of populist support.
Right. So in some ways, if you're if you're concerned about Trump in the U.S., that you're much rather, it might sound counterintuitive, but just to let him fizzle out and kind of fail, as opposed to impeach him.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but yeah, if you are anti-Trump, that might be you might want to pivot.
I think so. I mean, admittedly, most of the cases I've been referring to that tell you this is or we've been referring to that most tell you this is a bad idea are from emerging markets, and there's a problem with a lot of the commentary on populism. Is populism vanished from the earth? And not didn't vanish from the earth. It vanished from the advanced economies of the U.S. and Europe in the 1930s, and for the last 50 years, we don't have successful policy. One or two really don't. So the cases everyone kind of keeps coming back to are these emerging market cases where you have had populists over the past few years, and it is really hard to say how relevant these cases are to our current condition. But yeah, I would say that impeaching Trump is a really big risk.
Yeah, interesting. And in all of that, how do you think that the American system is holding up? The institutions are holding up in light of what's the political storm that is Donald Trump.
I would say so far, well. The thing I've really been disappointed by is the kind of hysterical reaction of. I think in some ways the reaction of the media, especially like the New York Times and Washington Post, has kind of confirmed a lot of Trump's narrative inadvertently, because it is so apocalyptic regarding Donald Trump and his support. And I do think it has calmed down and it's gotten better. The initial crazy narrative was just not the thing to do, and it was also totally wrong. I mean, that was like big in the 60s, but by the 70s, there's innumerable academic studies had proved, that's craziness, not relevant to populism, and or not relevant to political behavior in general, and so that was really negative. I think the more severe institutional problems probably are in Europe, and that is to do with the European Union. I mean, I think that the European Union is genuinely they can't influence it, and they're not wrong, because a lot of the really high positions of power are not elected, and I think that's driven a lot of this kind of anti-system notion, which we've seen this directly, of course, in the case of Brexit, but in other countries as well. You see people essentially campaigning against the European Union, and for the European Union to fix that, this is a really difficult challenge, because you need reforms that I think France has, to some extent, Macron has tried in part to suggest, but ultimately elected president of Europe, something along these lines, who really has the power, not just the sort of European Parliament. So who really has the power, and there have been steps made in that direction, but then always kind of goes back from that. And I think that is a really difficult institutional problem to solve, genuinely difficult. So far in the U.S., I don't feel that there's that level. I mean, I think there's a lot of problems in the U.S. that have led to this kind of rise. And here I'm just saying my own sort of personal opinions. The sort of campaign finance issues and things like that have, but I'm talking about this from a kind of a leftist perspective. If you're on the right, you would say the problem is big government, and big government is controlling people's lives in a way that is really detrimental to them. From whichever perspective, I think there are serious institutional problems in the United States, but ultimately U.S. institutions have held up. Where there's a real institutional challenge is Europe, I think.
In addition to Europe, are there other either parts of the world or things that concern you at the moment from a risk lens, I guess, a political risk lens, with regard to, I guess, the extension of populism? I suppose we talked about one of them, which is the response to populist movements. But are there other things that you think we need to keep our eyes peeled for?
Well, so if you historically but again, we haven't had much experience with populism in recent years, but the cases where populism has really caused serious trouble for political risk in a political risk sense have almost always been in emerging markets. Right? Hugo Chavez in Venezuela being an extreme example, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe being an extreme example. People who actually started fairly centrist. Mugabe, I don't think ever intended to play the card of expropriating farmland, but then he was going to start losing an election, and he just went off the rails. So it's countries that have very weak political institutions where these, in fact, you could say, and many scholars do say, what's more important than populism or inequality or any kind of ill that you might name is the strength of political institutions. If you know the institutions are strong, you're okay, right? Greece has had tremendous, it's been through the ringer. It's had this 50% collapse in income, and it's unimaginable. 50% collapse in the average income in a country. Yeah. Can you imagine what that would do to the UK? But in Greece, maybe this comes down to something like the Greek people are able to have a more tolerant and happy attitude to life. But the Greek democracy has so far survived, and that's this testimony to the power of institutions to deal with these kinds of problems. If you're going to worry about the impact of populism from a political risk perspective, certainly let's keep our eye on what's happening in the U.S. and Europe, but the real worry would be places like Mexico or Brazil, and even those are pretty strong. So the real worry is countries where the institutions are very weak, and that's where the political risk consequences in terms of the real political risk stuff, like a riot, strike, civil commotion, war, civil war, terrorism, that kind of thing. That's when you're talking about or expropriation of assets or currency crises. Well, there was a currency crisis in Greece, but currency crises, that kind of real political risk, bread and butter, will tend to be in the countries with weak institutions.
Wow, this has been fascinating, Sam. I think we covered quite a lot of ground. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention?
I know that's it's quite, really comprehensive and a great chat.
Cool. Before we wrap up, for my listeners, where can they get a copy of the book and follow you and learn a bit more about your work and all of that great stuff?
Well, the book is called History Repeating. It's published by Profile. It's in the UK only, actually, but you can get it anywhere on Amazon. I think it's out in India and Australia. Actually, in India, it did pretty well, oddly enough. I think people have a lot of experience with populism in India. But I'm on Twitter and the usual places, so you can find me there.
Perfect. And actually, before we go, history repeating, we didn't actually just touch on the title. So is that the point that you're making is what everything that we've talked about, I suppose, that we've been here before? Is that?
Well, actually, to be perfectly honest, it's because my editor likes a song by the Propellerheads.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. But so initially, the problem was with the book. It's called History Repeating: Why Populists Rise and Governments Fall. The problem was that by the time the book came out, there were so many books about this topic of populism. Even though I'd sort of started working on it before, because people weren't interested in it before, it hadn't really been picked up and published. So this ended up that title sort of to differentiate itself and put it out into the market like that in the celebration of the great work of the Propellerheads.
That's awesome. That's probably one of the best answers I've ever heard about a book title. So well done on that. All right, Sam, this was great. Thank you very, very much, and I wish you all the best with your future endeavors and with whatever book comes next or whatever comes next for you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye for now.